Welcome to Below the Line, where we talk about working in Hollywood from the crew perspective. My name is Skid. I'm a former assistant director and your host.
Quiet on the set.
Welcome back, listeners, to season 20 of the podcast. The break was a little longer than usual, but we've got some great episodes in the queue, and I appreciate you sticking with us. Today, we're talking about Avatar: The Last Airbender, specifically the Netflix live-action series that aired earlier this year. And my guest is costume designer Farnaz Khaki-Sadigh. Farnaz, welcome to Below the Line.
Hi, thanks for having me on.
Oh, I'm excited for you to be here. It's a show I enjoyed very much and looking forward to talking about. A warning for listeners, today's conversation will contain spoilers. For those who are not familiar, Avatar: The Last Airbender was originally an animated series that aired on Nickelodeon for 3 seasons between 2005 and 2008. In 2010, M. Night Shyamalan released a live-action theatrical film that was, and this is putting it generously, not well received. Farnaz, my first question for you. When you joined the Netflix project, how familiar were you with the source material and or the film incarnation?
Well, I was a big fan of the show when it came out, so I'd watched the series and I kind of followed it. So I was a big fan of the show to begin with, and I was very familiar with all the characters and the storylines and all of that. So I actually initially, when they announced that they were going to do a live action series, and I was just like, in my head, I'm like, that's the show I want to do. That's my job. So it manifested itself to life. So.
Now, some might say, well, then the cartoon basically did all the work. They got all the characters, they designed all the costumes. It was noted for its representation at the time. But talk to us more about your process and the research that went into designing for the live action show.
So the animation does outline a lot of sort of like historical references and cultural references in the show. And, it does pull a lot from the regions that it's referenced, and it does a really good job of that. However, turning animation into a live action, it's a whole other beast because you have to think about it in like, turning 2D to 3D, what you can draw on a piece of paper and the movements and the styles that are done are much more simplified for animation, just for the purposes of being able to like repeatedly draw something. But however, like certain things don't move the same way or don't sit the same way in reality. And so you have to kind of take all of those perspectives and go, okay, so this is the silhouette that's in the animation. This is what it looks like in reality. And then find the medium ground that works best. And then try and kind of figure out, okay, well, how does that sit on a human 3D version of a body? Like, that has to move, that has to fight, that has to like be comfortable in, doing their actions and performance. So it's a lot of like logistics to figure out in that sense as well.
How much ramp up did you have to do all this research before you were expected to produce anything?
So it's never enough, to be honest with you, but
that's a theme of this show. Our listeners understand that.
There's never enough prep time. I actually started doing research when I started to prepare for my interview because I had to put a presentation together for the show to sort of like do a pitch. So I started initial research, doing it, prepping my presentation. So that was like 3 months out from actual like getting hired. And then once I got hired, I had about, I would say about another 4 months till we went to camera. And I spent another like a whole time, doing research, looking at fabrics, starting to conceptualize and just having discussions with the production team and the creatives, just kind of like, trying to get the process going. And then throughout the season, as we were going along, I kind of never stopped doing research because there's always characters added to the script and coming to the show. And, there's things that come up in the episodes that you have to kind of figure out, okay, well, now we're at this point. What do we want this to look like? We're at this town, like, what does this town look like, or what culture does it represent, or what region do we want to kind of like reference here. So the research kind of is kind of an ongoing thing as you're going through the production.
Yeah, and you shared with me some of the materials you used, and I was very impressed. Not only going back to like what the decisions made by the animators back in early 2000s, but it looked like even going back to the source material of where they were drawing inspiration from. And I'm curious how much of that
Yeah.
follows through. Like, in other words, ancient fabrics or design styles, or does all of that kind of need to be modernized for what, again, is, to your point, we're going to talk more about it. There's a lot of fighting, a lot of moving, the martial arts, all of this action that, yeah, you
Yeah.
can draw it, but to do it with live people is another level.
The show is set in like mid 1800s in East Asia. So there's a lot of perspectives to take into consideration. One, we're not mid 1800s East Asia. Technology has advanced. Things are not made the same way. Materials don't contain the same sort of like dye content, texture, fibers and things like that. So we have to kind of try and somewhat take what's modern and make it more accurate to the history a little bit, and find pieces that actually look like their historical replicas. So that's one challenge. And then you have to like, I mean, I did a lot of like historical like studies in terms of like, okay, what was going on during that time in those regions? What was their trade routes? Like, who did they trade with? Was there a war? Was there like, things that affected what people wore? And, why did people wear what they wore at that time? And the different classes and all of that stuff and the functionality of things. And then again, like, the history, the climate of that time during that region, during that time period, a lot of that affects like, what was worn. So you have to take a look that and then just bring it into, okay, so this all affects how we're going to represent this world. And then on top of that, this is also a fantasy. So you do have a little bit of a leeway, but at the same time, it's like, it's a blend of like the animation, the history and the culture, and then the fantasy aspect of it. And then you take all those three and combine it and create a concept and a design.
And we're going to talk about a couple of sequences from the show to kind of hone in on specific examples of all the things we talked about, how it came to play. But before we get there, talk to me about the actors. Now, how did they take to these costumes?
I mean, a lot of times, like, they were very, very excited about things. It just sort of like really, in film and in theater, one of the things is like, the costumes tend to like really bring the character to life. Like you literally get to visually see what you look like as that character. Same with like hair and makeup. It just kind of like brings the whole package together. And I think that was their initial thought is like, wow, like I really look like this person, or wow, this really feels like, good. However, like, there are things like, that we're not used to. It's, like the leather armors that the soldiers wear, they are heavier. We had to do a lot of tests to make sure that people can move in it. I mean, we're used to wearing like t-shirts and jeans or, sweatpants and things like that that are comfortable, that are light, that don't weigh a lot, and don't restrict your movement. And here you are like wearing this like leather armor with, that weighs 50 pounds almost. And you have to try and move in it and do actions and do things that you know, you normally like even sitting in, you have to sit a certain way so that you're not crushing the leather, you're not crushing that, or that it's not cutting into your ribs or any part of your body in essence, right? It takes a little bit of getting used to. And we also had to do a lot of testing in terms of like making sure that everything that we created, though it looks historically accurate, it still is comfortable enough for a person in modern day to wear with their movements. So,
Well, yeah, let's bring that specifically to the series from the first episode where the Fire Nation attacks the Air Nomads. I think there's a couple of different things we can talk about here. The first thing that strikes me is the Air Nomads, even before they attack, I went back and watched the live action scene, and I also actually went back and watched some of the animation. And what struck me, because we're not just talking about a handful of main actors, we've also got all of the background. And in the animation, I think they get away with some generic looks because you're just moving through quickly with folks and it's a large battle. But for live action, it can't be as cookie cutter. And it's not. And I know even characters with small parts, their clothes need to look lived in. And so talk to me more about the Air Nomads and how they all came together.
Again, like animation, you can get away with a lot. A lot of like, the background can be blurred and, it can be very minimalistic. Whereas like when with us, with a live action, you really have to kind of put the effort in 100% on everyone because you don't know what you're going to see. You don't know what your eye is going to catch. Even though sometimes they do blur the background, you still see a lot of the details in the silhouette and the movement. And that fight, basically, it has a lot of stunt people. It has a lot of background, and it has main cast in it. So we had to build everything from scratch. We had to make sure that, there are details and variations. The Air Nomads, like, I mean, it's four nations, four factions of the Air Nomads are all there. We need to give them some variety in terms of like their look so that they don't all look the same. There's different color palettes for like, the South, the North, the East, the West, and some of the silhouettes are different so that we can kind of identify, this is a Southern Air Nomad versus this is a, Western Air Nomad per se.
Farnaz, let me ask you, it's come up on the show before, and I don't think I've ever clarified for folks who aren't working in the costume space. When you say the silhouette, what specifically are you describing? What is the silhouette from a costume perspective?
The silhouette is basically like, the shadow of the costume, the outline of the outside of the costume, it's
okay.
Or the person, what you see. So basically, like if I shine a light on you and it casts a shadow on the wall, what is the outline that you see? That's your silhouette. So
And so it does mean what I'm thinking, but you are paying
yeah,
specific attention to what's going to pick up, not necessarily even the detail, but then how it's just going to, what the shape and form is going to be overall.
exactly. Right. So, so even if it's blurred out, right, the shape of the Southern Air Nomads is different than the shape of the Western Air Nomads, right? So you can still tell who is who, but even if it's like the details are like faded away. And then same with the color and the hues, like, even if you don't see the exact details, you'll see like the color and the color will pop at you. And you're like, oh yeah, that's that. And that's that person, So you still want to have that detail where you don't get that in animation, but you do get that. You have to pay attention to that in live action. And then same with like the Fire Nation army is pretty much the same silhouette for all of them, but it is very different. We had to make sure that it's different than what the present day Fire Nation army looks like so that we can actually distinguish that this is 100 years ago as opposed to current time.
That's right. Another element we hadn't emphasized that this battle takes place 100 years
100
before
years.
our modern story. And so even you need to show some evolution of what's happened
Correct.
to the Fire Nation from then to the future.
And I mean, in a lot of it is the fact that like the armor becomes a lot more streamlined in the present day for their movements as opposed to like it's a little bit more elaborate and a little bit in shape and detail and all that stuff for the 100 years ago. So
now it's interesting because watching that battle 100 years ago, the Fire Nation, how to say, the focus is not on the Fire Nation to the same level. There's, from a cinematography perspective, it seems there's some intentional blurring or darkening. They are sort of a mass. But again, I don't see that saving you much because you don't know that this is going to be in shadow or that they're going to be a sort of a faceless army. And they're not entirely faceless and there are other scenes, but you really have to give it the same level of a detail as you would the Fire Nation army when we do see more of it in future episodes.
Yeah, and that's the thing. It's like when we're designing and when we're creating things, at the end of the day, we don't know what's going to end up on the cutting room floor, right? So, and what they're going to do in post and what they're going to include, what they're going to exclude, where they're going to like, change the color or shadow or add subtract. So we have to make sure that we put in the same focus on every single person that we see, just because it's like, if we don't, and all of a sudden, like they go and post and they say, okay, well, this is the best shot that we have, and this is what we're going to use. And all of a sudden it's like, it's all the people that don't have any details on them, right? And that doesn't really look good for our department.
Well, speaking of post, I also wanted to get your thoughts on the role of digital effects in a battle like this. And for example, you've designed all of this, but they're gonna take some characters and fly them up in the air.
So every character, every single character, actually, every single stunt, every single background, every single look, every single piece was actually digitally scanned for that purpose. So there's like digital scans of every single piece of prop, costume, set deck, like that they would, so that they could in post basically recreate, uh, replicate and duplicate the army, expand it, add to it, all of that stuff. I personally don't know exactly what goes into the process after that, but but I know that like for us, it's like basically we provide everything for them to be scanned, both on the body and off the body. So like sometimes it's just on a mannequin, sometimes you lay it flat and they scan it that way. And then sometimes it's the actor in basically like this very technical, like circular booth with like tons of lights and cameras that they just kind of like circles around them. It's crazy. It's really crazy.
We're still going to consider that magic from our perspective at this point. Until we get one of those folks on the show, we'll consider it magic. Now, this is a major sequence again when the Fire Nation is attacking the air nomads. Was this early in production, or did they put it off until I don't know, a couple of weeks in? How long was the shoot overall?
We had we were on, I would say like by the end of it, with all the reshoots and all that second unit stuff, like we were on there for almost a year and 4 months or
Wow,
something like that.
that's a
Yeah,
lot.
like it was a long process. Yeah, it was a long process. And then there was a huge other process after that for post. But we did the fight partially right at the beginning. It was like basically like the first block, and it's one of the things that we started with. Um, so they did the fight, and then we had a bunch of reshoots after the fact where we added sequences to it and did more to it because there was not enough shot originally. So we did have to like recreate and add to it, and build more people into the scene. So
Now, were there other aspects of that battle, either lessons learned from a costume perspective or small parts that you'd want to draw more attention to on a rewatch?
Um, I mean, it's just really like just I think textural for me. I get nitpicky for my work. So I look back and I'm just like, well, maybe a little bit more texture here would have been nice, a little bit more, detail here would have been nice. So yeah, so it's just like a lot of like just like nitpicky things for me that I would add. But overall, I mean, the amount of like, collaboration between us and the stunt team with all their action and the wire work, and then collaborating with like, VisFX, with all the scanning and the digital reproduction of everything. It was definitely a huge learning curve.
Well, I'm curious how that carries forward and if there's anything different that you would draw attention to in another major battle sequence. We'll jump all the way to the eighth episode when the Fire Nation, once again, it's not a spoiler to say they are the aggressors of this series. Now they're going to war with the water tribes. Talk to me about leading up to that battle, the costumes we're talking about now.
So the biggest difference is I think like the air nomads, the fabrics that we used on them, it's like a lot of like linens and cottons, and they have a lot more movement. They're a little bit more comfortable, easier to manipulate when you're trying to do like wiring work and stunt work. So for that sequence, that's basically what helped us is the material aspect of it. So the difference between the first fight and the battle at the end is that the Water Nation, they're in parkas, and those parkas are quite heavy. We have leather to deal with, we have fur to deal with. It's a they're not as agile as linens and cottons. They don't move as well. They're a lot more restrictive. So trying to kind of incorporate all of the wire work and cutting into those and making sure that it doesn't affect the look when you have like wires being pulled from every angle of you was a bit more challenging in that fight. And also for the actors in the stunt, it was a lot harder for them to move in those costumes than it was in the air nomad costumes that are have more flexibility to them.
Now, speaking of those costumes, one of the things that hopped out at me is how Soko, one of our main characters, he switches from his original Water Tribe look to sort of a combat look where he's picked up shoulder pads and talked about sort of the transformations of a main character and how important it is your work in that role.
I mean, we want to make sure that there's variety. That's one thing, like, you don't really get to have in an animation is variety for the characters. Whereas, when you're in a live action, you kind of want to give them a little bit more detail, a little bit more changes, and just kind of create a little bit more visual creativity for them, I guess. That's probably the best way to explain it. So we decided to give changes to the characters. Each character has a progression, a multiple of changes. Sokka has, his battle armor that he wears when he's fighting. He has his, a little bit more of a formal look, and he's got day to day, and then he also has his parka that he wears within the Northern Water Tribe when he first arrives because it's colder climate and when we see him in the south. His battle armor is something that like he's kind of pulled together himself, and created this for himself to fight in. And he wears it originally in his first fight with Zuko at the, first episode when Zuko arrives at the Southern Water Tribe. And we see it there first, but he has taken it with him on the road, and we see it at the end battle as well.
Yeah, speaking of Zuko, who's one of our main Fire Nation characters, he's now in gray, which I know to him might have been kind of a relief because it's a little more like pajamas than the army he's forced to wear up until this point of the series. But talk to me a little about his transition as well.
The whole point of that is, I mean, it is in the animation as well. He does wear a lighter color. It is really the purpose of it was for him in the animation. I believe it was for him to blend in with the ice and not go noticed, so that he's incognito per se, to enter the Northern Water Tribe so that he can nab Aang. We wanted to kind of like replicate that, and we wanted to create something that it's almost like a samurai ninja referenced look, but in a lighter gray version. It's basically the similar look to his actual Blue Spirit look, which is an all black version of it. We didn't want to go white to match the snow. We wanted to go a little bit more gray so that it stood out a little bit more still against the background. But it also is much lighter for him to fight in, and he does have a lot of battle sequences there. His big fight with Katara and his big fight with Zhao. So it did give him a lot more ease of movement than trying to fight them in the armor that he wears.
Well, but the people who don't get that advantage is the Fire Nation soldiers because they are
Yes.
here in large numbers. You talked about their armor earlier, and we're not just talking about main characters in armor. We've got tons of background in armor that's also maybe not as detailed as 100 years ago, as you said, but is still extremely detailed and looks like just an extreme effort to get everyone into those outfits and maintain it. And even they're not fighting. So you must have like tons of, I don't know how many background folks, maybe what would be the number of average background Fire Nation soldiers you need for a scene like this?
For the Fire Nation soldiers, we usually had about like 20 to 30 stunt soldiers, and then we had another like 20 to 30 background soldiers. So like say about 60 of them. And then we had the cast, versions of
Right.
them as well. Because they have like there's some of them have speaking lines, so they are cast and we normally when we do stunt stuff, we create multiples for them just in case like something breaks but these armors are so extensive that we couldn't like so it's just one per person. Except for the main cast. The main cast does have multiples, but for like our stunts and stuff. So there was a lot of like in between takes, like hammering rivets and, fixing things because they would pop. And, just every night, everything had to go in and get like repaired for the next fight or the next day and just touched up so that we could make sure. They went through hell and back, those armors. Gonna be interesting to see them for season 2. So
Well, what else from this battle really brought home costume issues that once again people might not notice on a first watch, but going back, things you'd want to draw their attention to?
it's an unfortunate thing, but there was a lot of scenes that were cut out. So that's the only sort of like sad part about it. We did build a lot for the Northern Water Nation tribe. There were a lot of costumes that we built. There's a lot of work that came in from like, a lot of Inuit artists that was included. So some of it got cut out because of, I think, timing and all of that perspective, just to make sure that they could get the story correct, which happens. It's, part of the film industry and part of the job. But yeah, there was a lot of things that we built that we didn't get to see, which was really unfortunate for us. And I think that that's sort of like the only miss about that episode for us.
Again, when you have that much going on and you don't know whether it's going to be reshoots to fill it out or things you're doing have to be cut back to keep the pacing. That's in somebody else's hands.
Yeah, it's crazy because a lot of effort goes into it, and then all of a sudden, like, you don't see half of it, and you're like, well, we could have saved time more and focus on the half that we do see if we had known, like, this half was not going to be seen at all. But yeah, anyways, we do it and we do it with love. So
well, what about the show overall? We focused on these 2 battles, which I think highlight a lot of costume issues each, but what are some of your favorites or memories, whether it's specific scenes or specific costumes that you're most proud of?
Everybody asks me this question to pick my favorite. And
Amongst
to be
your
honest
children,
with you,
I know.
it's
I wouldn't
really
ask
hard
it,
to pick. It's really hard to pick. Like, I mean, there was so much, blood, sweat, and tears that went to every piece that we built on this show. So every piece is precious.
Think of it this way. What outfit do people take for granted, maybe don't appreciate the amount of effort that went into that you'd really want to highlight?
I think the simplest ones were the hardest to make. Like, I mean, like Aang's was the simplest one, but that was like the one that we put in so much effort into just kind of like creating it. Like I've talked about this in another interview where it's like the amount of fabrics that we had, choices that we had to go through, the amount of like color corrections that we had to test in order to just create that simple look, make sure that the color was perfect, the fabric moved properly. It was a lot of effort, and it doesn't, because when you look at it, it's such a simple costume that you're like, oh, it's just nothing, in comparison. But it's like, it's such an iconic look from the animation. It had to be perfect. And the amount of like fabric tests and fabric swatches that we had to go through, amount of like testing that we had to do with like, movement to make sure that it moved properly, with all of his bending. It was a lot of effort that went into just a simple costume. So it's, those are the things. It's like, sometimes visually it looks so simple, but the effort that has gone behind it, it's just way more than something that is like elaborate and extensive. And that's basically like, one of the biggest challenges in costume design that goes unnoticed.
And the challenges of this show to draw attention to the invisible effort that goes in behind the scenes.
Yeah, exactly.
You alluded to those costumes holding up for second season. Netflix has announced that they're going to do a second season and a third season. Are you planning to go back? Can you share anything about what your schedule looks like or what the plans are?
I can't share too many details. I can't share too many of that. I am going back for the season two. I'm looking forward to it. It's going to be very exciting. So it's going to be a lot of new challenges to look forward to.
Well, we're looking forward to it as well. Audience, if you haven't taken the time to watch this, recommend you pick it up. And, when you know they're going to push through the story, Netflix doesn't always make the commitment to finish what they start. So it's really nice in this case that you can get into it knowing there's going to be more coming down the line. On that note, we're going to call it a wrap. Farnaz, so great having you here.
Thank you so much. It was been fun.
Listeners, I hope you've had fun as well. I always appreciate your feedback. You can find my contact info on our website, belowtheline.biz. That's B-I-Z. You'll also find past episodes and links to all of our social media. So yeah, please check it out. Farnaz, while we're waiting for that next season of Avatar, where else can people see your work?
I just did a feature version of Henry Danger, which was a Nickelodeon sitcom. They did a feature version of it where they wanted to make it more of like an actual superhero show. So that's going to be coming out probably before season 2 of Avatar.
I think it was first season of this show. I did an interview with the ADs from Henry Danger, and it might be our most popular downloaded episode ever. So I'm going to watch for that feature movie for us, and you should consider coming back to talk about it. We're going to keep an eye out.
I would love to. It was a very good show to work on, and it was actually a lot of like interesting things that we got to build and redo. So can't share too much because it's not out yet. So
I won't press you on it, but we're going to keep our eyes open.
Yes, sounds good.
My closing credits, thanks to Curtis Five for our music, John Wan for our logo, and to all of our listeners, I appreciate you. The Below the Line logo is available on t-shirts, mugs, and stickers at redbubble.com. Please rate us wherever you get your podcasts, and please tell your friends. Thanks again from Below the Line.